Hi there, Jon Pahl here, coming to you from Juneau, Alaska, where I met my son and daughter-in-law, Justin and Genevieve's beautiful home on the side of a hill, looking out over the bay. It's a little rainy and foggy today, but we had a good afternoon. I helped my son repair their deck and build a little swale in their backyard for the channel rainwater. It was a good day of work. And now I'm here to talk with you about this extraordinary book, which we'll be reading this coming week and talking about in your reading response paper, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Extraordinary book has changed the way I think about American history indelibly. And I hope it does that for you too. I'm just going to go through the book chapter by chapter, highlighting a few things that are important to me, a few tangents, raising a few questions about the book from the perspective of public theology. In the author's note, she declares right up front that decolonizing U.S. history is a crucial task of her writing. And one of the key elements in that is a new periodization, that is understanding history in new epochs and eras, seeing the valleys and the mountains, mountaintops in different ways, and breaking up time differently as well. And that's one of the things that this book offers to us, I think, is a way to think about time differently, and certainly to think about the periods of American history differently. Page 13, Roman numerals in the author's notes, she writes, colonization, dispossession, settler colonialism, genocide. These are the terms that drill to the core of U.S. history. And the question for a public theologian throughout this is, where were the Christians in relationship to those phenomena? Colonialism, dispossession, settler colonialism, colonization, and genocide. Into the introduction then, page 1, note the key link between destruction of indigenous ways of life and destruction of the earth, the destruction of life itself, biocide, you might call it. Certainly a topic for public theologians, environmental theologians, anyone who's concerned about our planet and life, basically. She writes, Dunbar-Ortiz does, page 1, everything in U.S. history is about the land. A lot of Christian history tends to be teleological, that is, it focuses on cause and effects, beginnings and ends. And Dunbar-Ortiz's approach turns instead to the land as that which endures and that which is crucial for public theologians to consider. What that means is that we have to rethink the consensual national narrative. We've lived with a mythic history, especially, I think, in American religious history, where there is an innocence assumed or asserted, or if not assumed or asserted, then a victim status inserted into the historical record on the part of people who, in fact, have lived with great privilege and violence, namely mostly white Europeans. Much of history then, including American religious history to date, has been, in Dunbar-Ortiz's word, apologies for one-sided robbery and murder. Page 6, the form of colonialism, this is an interesting point, I think, that indigenous peoples of North America have experienced was modern from the very beginning. That is, government and corporations tied together, along with the indispensable use of Christian missionaries to advance the dispossession of native peoples. And how is the modern or modernity a problem in public theology and in relationship to American religious history? It seems to me that modernity has often been a mask for one form or another of what I call innocent domination in my book, Empire of Sacrifice. Page 8, note well the UN Convention on Genocide, describing, coming out of the European Nazi genocide in particular, the different characteristics or marks of genocide. If you think the term is too strong, take a look at those characteristics and see how the U.S. treatment of Indians matches up. And then how can we celebrate, honestly, the 4th of July? It's a question that Frederick Douglass, of course, famously asked in his speech, what to the slave is the 4th of July, but it's also a question I think all of us ought to ask in any nationalistic celebration. How can we participate in uncritical celebration of a nation whose history is riddled with blood? 4 periods of genocide that Dunbar-Ortiz tracks. The first one being the Jacksonian era of forced removals, with roots in Pilgrim and Puritan treatment of Native Americans as well, along with the Virginia settlers. Second period, the California Gold Rush of the 1840s and 50s. And then third, the Civil War area of Indian Wars leading up to the 1890s, total war, basically. And then fourth period of the 1950s, termination. That was the official policy of the U.S. government, termination of the sovereignty of Indian nations. Note how these 4 periods contrast with how they are understood in consensus history. Jacksonian era of forced removals, usually understood as, the era of Jacksonian democracy, especially in American religious history, the rise of evangelicalism, etc. Dunbar-Ortiz reinforcing what Butler is saying, namely that the rise of evangelicalism in American religious history coincides with the emergence of racist ideologies and the expression of racist ideologies and policies and practice. The Civil War area, or the California Gold Rush, the Civil War area, understood as an era of liberation and booming economic life and so forth, but in fact it was total war and devastation against civilian populations among the Lakota and others. And then the 1950s, the termination policy coincided with expression of the so-called greatest generation in U.S. history. I don't know. Page 12 points out that many of the Native American nations have more land and more people than nations that are represented in the United Nations. So why is it that the Navajo, for instance, are not represented in the United Nations? Have you ever asked yourself that question? In other words, this is not a minor story at all in terms of the history of peoples. It's a significant component, and of course, replayed with indigenous populations in many different places around the world: Canada, Australia, South Africa. So what we have lived with in the consensus history to date has been provincialism and with a heavy dose of national chauvinism. It's on page 13. All right, I'll move more quickly through the chapters, sometimes taking a couple at a time, just to highlight how she periodizes history and how that periodization gives us a very different story than the usual progressive or conservative historiography of the U.S. Chapter 1, Follow the Corn. There are a lot more extensive histories of the nations she describes here. She's drawing them together in a consensus, but around 1,500, maybe 100 million indigenous peoples in a diverse number of nations. And, they lived long and well with abundant ceremonial and recreational periods, Dunbar-Ortiz says. Contrast this with Europe at the same time. Hobbes came along, early 1600s, and said for most people living in Europe, life was short, nasty, and brutish. And the number of peoples, the names of the peoples are worth invoking. So many: Mayans, Olmecs, Aztecs, Pueblo, Navajo, Apache, the island peoples, Cahokia. If you've ever been to the mounds, it's extraordinary. Cherokee, Chickasaw, Iroquois, Lenape, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Lakota, Dakota, Salish, Mokahupa, Shoshone, Bannock, and on and on and on. Tlingit here in Alaska. They governed, by and large, by consensus. Imagine that in public theology, not by majority rule, and generally their form of government. There were confederations, consolidations, cooperation. Of course, there was conflict too. But relations with the spirit world were a major factor in government, Dunbar-Ortiz says, page 26. What are the implications of that for the United States and the separation of church and state and the assertion of religious freedom? Native American issues have often been prominent in recent years in religious freedom questions until the evangelicals kind of took it over as their way to express their racism and sexism through policy. Stewards of the land, they used fire in relationship to agriculture, corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. Lewis and Clark understood America as a vast pasture, gardens, and roads. For instance, if you've ever been on Lincoln Drive or the Schuylkill Expressway, you're riding Lenape trails. Basically, North America in 1492 then was not a virgin wilderness, but a network of indigenous nations, peoples of the corn. Chapter 2, the culture of conquest. Fascinating to me how she links the emergence of capital and Christianity in a crusader ideology and connects crusading to the treatment of the indigenous peoples in the United States. How does U.S. history appear then if the crusader, a Christian figure, is the dominant figure rather than the patriot, the secular patriot, say? Worth considering, given that the school that I graduated from with my undergraduate just recently voted to remove the Crusader as the mascot that it has held since the 1940s. The Crusader. Land as private property emerges as a European concept. It was not something that the indigenous peoples of North America understood or practiced. And how is this then an issue in public theology, the whole notion of private property? What does Christian faith have to say about that? Does Christian faith align more with indigenous perspectives on lands than the capitalist? I am inclined to think so, but why or why not? And how different would our world be if land itself were sacred rather than private property being sacred, which is what has basically emerged under capitalism? We're living then in our relationship to the land with the ghost of Plato, as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks put it, also the ghost of Augustine, as I argued in my book Shopping Malls and Other Sacred Places, Putting God in Place, which is a critique of typical American understandings of place, notably in shopping malls, Walt Disney World, and the suburban home, focused on rituals of domestic sanitation and lawn care. And then a recommendation of how the Bible itself actually understands sacred space, namely in terms of living waters, the light of the world, the rock of salvation, the true vine, one body, and cities of God. Page 36, the demonization of indigenous peoples has many parallels down to today. It's easy for human beings to do violence against another when we are convinced that the other is not just an enemy, but is evil, demonic, Satan, aligned with Satan, and so forth. Those dualisms are at the root of much religious violence. Still in chapter 2, class leveling based on imagined racial sameness is the origin of white supremacy. And notice how the discrete indigenous nations were consolidated under one heading of Indian. So this racial categorization reinforces white supremacy by eliding difference. And Protestantism, Dunbar-Ortiz points out, uniquely refined white supremacy as an aspect of a political religious ideology. It's very clear if you look at the historical record. And again, it's not just evangelicalism, it's Protestantism more broadly, which represents most, if not all, of us in this course. She talks about terminal narratives in particular, and here I want to invoke one of my teachers at the University of Chicago, Jonathan C. Smith, who talked about the lachrymose theory of history, namely only focusing on the tragedy associated with peoples has a way of ironically perpetuating those tragedies, or setting up narratives of self-defeat that endure and have significant impact over time. Chapter 3, The Cult of the Covenant. Francis Jennings has done some extraordinary work as a historian, and Dunbar-Ortiz quotes him: Europeans did not settle the virgin land, they invaded and displaced a resident population. This is so simple a fact that it seems self-evident, and yet it is a fact that often eludes American historians and American religious historians, especially. Going back to the Calvinist origin story, then, these noble pilgrims coming over to flee religious persecution, taking the Exodus as their model, imagining setting up a city on a hill, and so forth. And how does then this notion of election, predestination, the covenant play itself out in U.S. public theology? Back in the 60s and 70s, Robert Bella, sociologist at the University of California, Berkeley, wrote a number of important books about American civil religion, including one called The Broken Covenant. If you're interested in tracking some of that history, I recommend his work highly. Key insight for me here was the role of the Ulster Scots in settler colonialism in the 18th century. 250,000 migrated. This happens to be my wife's family lineage, and I've given her some ribbing about this. But the notion that these Ulster Scots, page 54, were entitled to the land through their blood sacrifice is one that is replicated in much U.S. military rhetoric today. And the way that plays itself out in policy is sacred land becomes real estate. The irony here, of course, is that for Christians, land is always a gift of God. And here, see Walter Brueggemann's beautiful book on land in the Hebrew Bible, where land is clearly understood as gift, temptation, task, and threat. And no more so than now, given climate change in global history. Chapter 4, Bloody Footprints. I think it's important to note that global imperial sensibilities grow out of Indian wars. In other words, there's a dovetail between what's happening domestically here, the militarization and genocide of Native peoples, and then what happens in U.S. foreign policy as well, with the taking of notably Hawaii, the Philippines, and others. But from the very beginning, this sort of mentality played itself out. The roots of genocide, as Dunbar-Ortiz puts it, are in extreme violence against civilians, manifest against civilians. And here, see a description of the Pequot War on page 62. I'll post a little essay that I wrote about this too. Really grotesque behavior, including scalp hunting and behavior by what Dunbar-Ortiz calls settler parasites, who steal from, take practices of Native peoples and then do them harm. Long history of war, including armed settlers, vigilantes, bounty hunters, waging total war against the Native peoples. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, The Birth of a Nation and Andrew Jackson's White Republic. I think we can put together. The colonizers, according to the Seneca corn planter, were town destroyers. That's his name for them. Take a look at Tecumseh and the story of Tecumseh. He had a public theology. What was it? And when you take a look at Andrew Jackson and his behavior as described by Dunbar-Ortiz, you'll understand why she calls him a genocidal sociopath. And yet, take a look at who's on your $20 bill. His acts, quote, page 93, culminated in the elimination of indigenous power east of the Mississippi River. What was Andrew Jackson's public theology then? He's understood as the great democratizer. For instance, on how this gets whitewashed, a book by Nathan Hatch, the former president of Notre Dame, entitled The Democratization of American Christianity, in which he draws this rosy picture of the emergence of Christian Democrats, small d, during the Jacksonian era. Staying with chapters 5 and 6, enduring populist imperialism, page 104, for instance, the character of Daniel Boone, and the emergence of narratives through figures like James Fenimore Cooper, who capture the imagination of the Anglo-American settler and make a whole lot of money in the process. These narratives are instrumental in nullifying guilt related to genocide because they put together a hero myth, the individual hero who happens to be killing heathens. Page 113, Crossing the Mississippi, as told by Alexis de Tocqueville, the story of I think it's Cherokee and their dogs. If you want to see this played out in more detail, check out the documentary by Raoul Peck, the director of I'm Not Your Negro, who also put together a four episode documentary entitled Exterminate All the Brutes. It's devastating. The first episode in particular is really strong. The others kind of wander, honestly, but I considered using it as a supplemental text for this and still recommend, like I said, episode 1, and perhaps you would find the other episodes more coherent than I, but definitely lifting up, again, a similar narrative trope or line, namely the genocidal history of the United States. And the way that plays that out for many Christians and public figures is through denial and the persistence of denial for the kind of behaviors that Dunbar-Ortiz is lifting up is a crucial problem in public theology, as I see it. She implicates even Barack Obama for perpetuating this historical mythology. Chapter 7 and 8, From Sea to Shining Sea and Indian Country, note Walt Whitman's rhetoric about Native peoples and African Americans, expecting them both to be eliminated as inferior races, and yet we have a big bridge in Philly named for this man. I don't know. U.S. overseas imperialism isn't new, but again, parallels the domestic story. I think it's really helpful for Dunbar-Ortiz to draw these two parallels. Page 125, note the way Franciscan missionaries are implicated in the settling of California in relationship to the gold rush, before the gold rush, but also during, and exterminated more than 100,000 California native people in 25 years. That's pretty rapid destruction in that state. Even Abraham Lincoln, his emphasis on free soil for settlers before and coming up to the Civil War led to immigration, and of course led to Indian slaughter, not to mention buffalo slaughter as well. Page 136, interesting connection here, a mass hanging of Lakota, the largest single public execution in American history, in fact, in Minnesota in 1862. Lutherans, no doubt, participating at the forefront. Check out, if you're interested, the book by Dave Kruger, Krueger, about the Kensington Rooney stones, based on a dissertation he did with me at Temple a few years ago. It's now out as a book. It's an amazing story about how this so-called Rooney stone, that's why the Minnesota football team is called the Vikings. This Rooney stone, supposedly left behind in the 13th century by Vikings, meant that Minnesota, therefore, was white, and the U.S. was white, and this allowed Lutherans and Catholics, Kruger argues, to cooperate in Indian slaughter, and he uses this mass hanging in 1862 as a crucial scene in his book. Central problem in public theology, again, is the construction of whiteness. And if you want to read about how Lutherans were involved in that, along with Roman Catholics in Minnesota, Kruger's book would be a great place to start. John Chivington, the fighting parson, the architect of the Sand Creek Massacre, page 137 in 1864. Note how his soldiers are taking relics, body parts of native peoples. See pages 231 to 235 for this as well. This is a consistent theme throughout U.S. history. Annihilation and total surrender, as Dunbar-Ortiz puts it on 149. And note well the role of residential schools in this, including the one in Carlisle, the Carlisle Indian School. There's been some good writing about this later. If you're interested in checking out a documentary film on this, that's actually a feature film, but based on accurate historical research, Where the Spirit Lives, is a focused story of one Native American school, actually run by the Episcopalians in Canada. It's a good film, not great, but lifts up that story, which is repeated over and over and over again, including in multiple schools here or in Wisconsin, where I live, and here in Alaska, Canada, elsewhere. What was the public theology operative behind those schools? The whole notion of civilizing. How does civilizing work as a trope in U.S. public theology and as a mask for rationalization of genocide, cultural genocide, the exterminating of ceremonies, rituals, practices, dress, clothing, all of these things that are crucial markers of identity, obviously deeply rooted in spiritual practices as well. The ghost dance and the emergence of the ghost dance, a beautiful dream, emerges. Page 153, Dunbar-Ortiz takes us into that, this widespread sort of apocalyptic longing for a return to a time before the arrival of European people in North America who lived according to the creed, greed is good. Indigenous refugees, Dunbar-Ortiz says, this is 157, were deposited in Indian territory, piled on top of each other in smaller and smaller reservations. Again, that's just a fact about our history. Moving quickly to the last few chapters, 9, U.S. Triumphalism and Protective Colonialism, Josiah Strong, Our Country, 163, put together perhaps the most highbrow articulation of white supremacist public theology. That's on 163, and Strong's book was extraordinarily influential in linking, again, extermination of indigenous peoples here with U.S. overseas imperialism in the name of manifest destiny. By the 1920s, indigenous peoples, Dunbar-Ortiz says, were at their lowest point, both in population and possibility for survival. This is precisely the period that Louise Erdrich writes about in Tracks, the book will be taken up in conjunction with Dunbar-Ortiz's book, and I'll have more to say about that by next week for you. I think it's an extraordinary novel, and I love it. It's funny, it's beautifully written, and poignant, powerful, and just a real fine articulation of the struggle between indigenous ways and accommodation to Christianity, set in a microcosm among the Ojibwa people. Story goes on in kind of a big jump here to the civil rights era. By 1960, Dunbar-Ortiz says more than 100 indigenous nations have been terminated, including near where I live now, the Menominee. They really had to fight, led by a woman by the name of Ada Deer, who would be a fascinating figure to study her public theology, because they reclaimed their status as a nation and now have the Menominee Nation Tribal College underway. It's done exceptionally well, and the tribe has really the nation has really been resurgent as well in some surprising and wonderful ways, due in many ways, in large part to the work of Ada Deer and James White and other Menominee. Chapter 10, Ghost Dance Prophecy, A Nation is Coming. What you see among indigenous peoples in North America is a shift in consensus will and vision towards self-determination and land restitution. This prevails down to today, and this is really the trajectory that it's important to recognize, again, in contrast to the lachrymose theory of history or the merely tragic. Don't want to romanticize what's going on, but the persistence and survival and determination of Native peoples, including through their ceremonies, rituals, is extraordinary. You know, tenuous connections, including in the languages of the diverse peoples. That's really a story worth attending to. Where is the church in relationship to this process, you might ask? Where are Christians sitting in a typical Lutheran pew or Baptist pew? Largely unaware, silent at best, complicit, actively engaged in resisting indigenous claims, blithely accepting understandings of private property and everything that goes along with it. So the question has to be in public theology, what do we do about land restoration and in particular sacred sites? Note the case of the Black Hills. When it's close to me, I had family living in South Dakota, and we would frequently travel to the Black Hills. The first time, of course, to go to this extraordinary monstrosity of a public theological shrine called Mount Rushmore, a desecration to the first peoples of North America, you know, balanced now by the Crazy Horse monument, but you know, there it is, those four presidential heads and everything they represent, carved out of the sacred rock of the Pahasapa, the Black Hills. Check out the Alcatraz Proclamation on page 183. The satire here is a characteristic feature of Native cultures and that I have been fortunate to be connected with. It's a survival strategy, this use of humor to undercut this ironic understanding, you know, is a survival mechanism. And both of those would be interesting topics to explore in U.S. public theology. That is the relation of irony and satire, humor, even in its character as a characteristic mode of public theology. It's not one that comes very naturally to me, but I sure appreciate it when there's somebody who can collectively make us laugh together. Another trope or theme, dividing and conquering, how that works. I mean, this goes back to the Roman Empire, of course, divides et impera, divide and conquer. I just want to share one quote with you from page 191. The logical progression, Dunbar-Ortiz says, of modern colonialism begins with economic penetration and graduates to a sphere of influence, then to protectorate status or indirect control, military occupation, and finally annexation. Like colonized peoples elsewhere in the world, a little further down the page, the Sioux have been involved in decolonization efforts since the mid-20th century. And I think that's the turn in historiography, at least in American religious history, that's important to highlight. There's a wonderful website about the Lakota in particular, Lakota, not Dakota resource page, something along those lines, comes out of the University of Nebraska, and Martin Brokenleg. And there's an entire section in there, a declaration of war against appropriators of Native traditions. Take a look at that and consider how easily images, rhetoric, symbols, and other features of Native culture have been appropriated without recognition of the policies that have been, again, genocidal. Indian wars have been a template for the U.S. in the world. Dunbar-Ortiz says on 196, a red thread of blood connects the first white settlement in North America with today, and she suggests with the future two last chapters, the Doctrine of Discovery. If your church hasn't discussed this yet, your congregation, I ask you why. The World Council of Churches, the UCC, the Unitarian Universalists, and others have simply asserted the critique, the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, the idea that Columbus and others discovered a quote unquote virgin land. Instead, Native people say we wish to continue to exist. Sovereignty and self-determination is an important category in public theology, I think. Sovereignty and self-determination. Do communities, we might ask, have a right to self-determination? If not, why not? Under what conditions? Does God change that at all? Does belief in God? How about Jesus? The Holy Spirit? What about interreligious claims across cultures to self-determination? Anyway, it seems to me it's an important category in public theology. Somebody might want to take up sovereignty and or self-determination. Comes down then to land claims, page 205. Notably, the Black Hills offered $106 million in 1980 and have refused the money down to today. It's the land that matters. It cannot be monetized. Contrast this emphasis on self-determination and integrity, as you might say, with the narrative of dysfunction that continues to be repeated about Native peoples. Of course, there are troubles, but what are the causes of those troubles? Historically, among Indigenous peoples, quote, everyone has responsibility and rituals to perform that involve a particular geography. That's page 211. What happens then when that geography no longer is accessible to the people who need that geography in order to practice the rituals that keep them responsible to themselves and to others? To be civilized, it was understood by Native people as to be like the white man. Again, that category of civilizing, of civilization, and the process is worth interrogating in public theology. Dunbar-Ortiz points out, for example, the practice of corporal punishment of children unknown among Native and Indigenous communities, but emphasized in the boarding schools and in other places where children were routinely assaulted. Constitutions of diverse nations begin to emerge in association with this quest for self-determination. In 2009, the White Earth Nation, the Chippewa, again represented in Louise Erdrich's book, published their Anishinaabe Constitution. Check it out. I'm sure it's available in full text online if you'd be interested in taking that up as a matter of public theology. What does an Indigenous Constitution look like compared to, say, the U.S. Constitution? And what are the theological implications of those two documents and that way of living together as peoples? Chapter 12, the future of the U.S. Dunbar-Ortiz is not particularly rosy, but that future given our professional military, legalized torture, drone warfare, and others, the just increased militarization and arming of the American people. 900 military bases around the world, more guns than there are people by a long shot. According to Dunbar-Ortiz, page 228, North America is a crime scene. Wrap your head around that particular narrative or understanding of U.S. history. One more quote, page 229 to 30, the bottom. In the United States, the legacy of settler colonialism can be seen in the endless wars of aggression and occupations, the trillions spent on war machinery, military bases, and personnel, instead of corporations, instead of social services and quality public education, the gross profits of corporations, each of which has greater resources and funds than more than half the countries in the world, that pay minimal taxes and provide few jobs for U.S. citizens. The repression of generation after generation of activists who seek to change the system, the incarceration of the poor, particularly descendants of enslaved Africans, the individualism carefully inculcated that on the one hand produces self-blame for personal failure, on the other exalts ruthless dog-eat-dog competition for possible success, even though it rarely results, and high rates of suicide, drug abuse, alcoholism, sexual violence against women and children, homelessness, dropping out of school, and gun violence. These are symptoms, and there are many more, of a deeply troubled society, and they are not new. Where then has the church been in relationship to that litany of events described by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and that will be described in more intimate terms through the fiction of Louise Erdrich Trax? I look forward to your second reading response papers. I'll be grading your papers on white evangelical racism shortly. Unfortunately, Professor cannot be with us personally, but she's going to send me a few links to some podcasts if you want to see what Anthea Butler has to say in person, in addition to having read her books. Hope you're off to a good start in the course. Look forward to continuing to work with you. Hope this little overview of this extraordinary text by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz will be helpful. She acknowledges Vine Deloria Jr., extraordinary mentor for her and prophetic voice in truth. One last word, the denial of sacred lands and sites is a form of genocide. The denial of sacred lands and sites. Once again, bringing us back to the violence against indigenous peoples coinciding with the violence against the land and the earth itself. It is my expectation that when we collectively, as a people, as the United States, resolve our problem of violence against Native peoples, we will also find will, spirit, resources, means to address the climate crisis at the same time. Not a cheery read, but it's a foggy and rainy day here in Juneau, so my mood kind of coincides. But I find this book, in the end, exceptionally hopeful, actually, as an honest recounting of the history and as a call for repentance and a new way as we move forward together. Look forward to discovering that with you. That would be a true discovery over the coming weeks. Peace, and see you next week.